like to introduce Dave Noble. Dave's an associate professor in the wildlife biology program at the university here. He teaches courses in landscape ecology, wildlife habitat, and wildlife and people. Among his 40-plus papers in peer-reviewed journals are a slew of papers on sage-grouse, including research on habitat, energy development, and West Nile virus. His work has been featured in popular conservation magazines such as Audubon. Dave utilizes advanced research methods from satellite imagery to chemical isotopes to remain at the forefront of conservation research. He will be speaking on the challenge of conserving sage-grouse, a widespread species of declining habitat, as truly one of the experts on this threatened bird. Sage-grouse have the potential to become the next spotted owl, so it'll be interesting to hear a perspective that may offer cooperation instead of controversy. For the afternoon plenary talk, we welcome Dave Noble, speaking on running conservation like a business, linking science and management to benefit populations.
So you ever notice if you smile at people, they smile back? Isn't that great? Yeah. So thanks for the invitation from Robin and the Society. I appreciate it. Thought a lot about the topic, and I'm going to incorporate sage-grouse, but at the same time I want to talk about landscape conservation and sort of being strategic and almost replacing a conservation attitude with a business attitude in the way that we go about doing our work. And so I'm really going to do two talks. One is using the backdrop of the crown of the continent to talk about strategically focusing our conservation efforts and how we go about finding shared vision with conservation partners. And then I got an opportunity this year to do a science advisor for USDA as they're kicking off a new NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, special sage-grouse initiative in the 11 western states. And so the first part of the talk, sort of look at it and say, okay, I agree or I don't agree with your basic principles, and then I'm going to show you how I'm trying to incorporate those into NRCS's special initiative. And so take-home messages for today, 7 of them really. 1, prioritize relentlessly, because there's never going to be enough money in the world to affect all of the acres that we want to do conservation for wildlife on. 2, how, from a business perspective, do you work with your conservation partners to identify and then articulate shared vision? Number 3, the most important aspect of conservation, building trust and credibility with the folks that you want to do landscape conservation with. And then something that we often forget, let's actually fix what's wrong in the system to benefit populations. And then think about how do we link applied science to assess what the biological outcomes are when you're doing on-the-ground conservation. And then I'll talk a little bit about our sage-grouse initiative and then some flashbacks on lessons learned, because the more that you can think about this stuff now while you're in school with the bulk of the audience being students, the more you can learn about that now instead of go and in your first job and learn it all in the school of hard knocks, the better off will be, because you guys are our next group of conservation practitioners. And so we still have tremendous intact landscapes with their full complement of native species in Montana and throughout the West. But there are large-scale impacts coming down the pipe that we need to deal with, things like subdivision. And so the last fight that you ever fight from a conservation perspective is cement. And once it's cement and roads, there's not a lot that we can do about that. Invasive species, both in the plant and the animal world. Tillage agriculture, especially in places where I do a lot of research in eastern Montana. Once it goes from shrublands and native vegetation to black dirt's a surrogate for cement from a conservation standpoint. And then new things like, not only from a tillage perspective as we try and secure domestic food security, but also domestic energy security. And so first point of the talk is to proactively prioritize where you work. And I like to call this conservation triage. And so what do we need from a biological perspective to understand where populations are, that if we did enough of the right things in the right places, we could actually expect biological benefits on those conservation investments. And the thing that I love, one of my favorite sayings from one of the folks that I've worked with here in Montana, he says, you gotta prioritize, because If everything is important, all of a sudden nothing is important. Focusing long-term and proactively in areas where we think we can succeed from a conservation standpoint is a tough thing to get into some people's minds. We're humans, and so by nature, if we like wildlife, we tend to be reactionary instead of proactive, and we sort of chase the ambulance, and we go from one declining population where there's so many stressors and there's really nothing we're going to be able to do about it, but that tends to be where we end up throwing a lot of money, while as we look in the rearview mirror, those big and intact landscapes that still exist, they continue to erode away. And so how do we get ahead of the train, so to speak, from a conservation aspect? And every dollar that we spend on that palliative care is a dollar that's going to be lost to long-term conservation. And so I thought I'd start the talk, take you to one of those large and intact landscapes that's right here in our backyard. And when I teach my 560 landscape conservation class, I do it with Greg Nidecker, who's a tremendous practitioner in landscape conservation, and he's actually now one of our faculty affiliates in wildlife biology. And so some of the messages that you're going to hear today come from his experience of 20 years as a practitioner in the Blackfoot. And so sort of second take-home message for the day is to be able to identify and articulate shared vision with the conservation partners that you're embarking on for the long term. And that's where I sort of put that first part of the talk, doing conservation like a business. I don't think in the conservation arena that we're either taught to do it or that we do it practically enough to sit down and almost do market research as if we're the CEO of a big company like IBM. They spend hours in the smoke-filled room sitting there talking about what is the shared vision where when we come to the table with the folks we want to work with in conservation, what are the commonalities that we all share? Where's that simple home run, common shared solution going to be? And they think of it as market research. I think we need to do a much better job of that, because that issue of establishing a clear and authentic relevance, it's everything, because people outside of the conservation world, they want to participate in things that they think are important, not things that the 1% of society that's most concerned about wildlife conservation thinks is important. And so where in that Venn diagram is that overlap where we all come together? And so that task of articulating relevancy, if it slips through the cracks of your business plan, the entire flower is going to wilt and die before it ever has an opportunity to take root. In the Blackfoot, their shared vision is brilliant. They're concerned biologically about large and intact landscapes. They're concerned about connectivity. They're concerned about all of the things that we are when you're sitting in the crown of the continent, one of the places that has their entire complement of native species. But when they talk to producers and other conservation partners, they don't sit down at the table and try and sell grizzly bear habitat, even though it's there and it's functioning and it's some of the best anywhere on the continent. They talk to folks about their interests and concerns and things that are important to them. And so the shared vision is about sustainable ranching, rural ways of life. The commonality there is, yeah, if we can continue to produce cattle and maintain that rural way of life, which is what their dad and their dad's dad did, subdivision issue goes away. And so 90% of what we're talking about is all the same, but it's encapsulating what that shared vision is and how that message comes across when you're interacting with people that you want to have long-term relationships with. Another great way to do that, and if you've taken Scott Mills's 470 wildlife populations class, you've read the chapter in his book about focal species concepts. And so folks in the Blackfoot and in other land places that are successful in landscape conservation think a lot about focal species. And so everybody sitting in this room, we could go around, they probably have their favorite species, right? And you would hit non-game bird enthusiasts, you would hit plant enthusiasts, you would hit a lot of folks that are worried about rare and endangered things that we want to do conservation and keep on the planet, but that we don't have enough biological inventory data to ever build a solid enough base for strategically implementing conservation. And so you sit there and you go, well, we need to do two things then. Think about where do we have enough biological information and for what species, and then pick those species very carefully on two fronts. The first front is to pick species that are able to reflect the ecological dynamics of the system that we're interested in conserving. But then secondly, also paying attention to shared vision and selecting species that play into the thought process of our conservation partners. So I threw up a couple of examples. Bull trout versus cutthroats. And so bull trout and cutthroat need about the same thing, the 4 C's, right? Clear, cold, complex, and connected. Those are sort of the keys in conservation for native trout species. But if I want to go to the conservation table, I probably talk less about bull trout or not at all, and I talk more about cutthroats in multiple arenas. First of all, bull trout, T&E, threatened and endangered type of critter. Newest newspaper article says we're identifying critical habitat for them right now. That freaks a lot of producers and private landowners that might not want to have T&E species on their land. But at the same time, everybody knows cutthroat trout. They don't mind them on their property. They see the link a lot of times between clean water for their family and cattle production. And if a fish is a good indicator of that, they have no problem striving for that kind of goal. The sporting public, cutthroats, yeah, love to catch them, taste great. They're my favorite angled fish. A lot of times I catch a cutthroat, I'm reeling it in, and a big old bull trout will come up and eat the fish I'm trying to take and put in my freezer or take home to eat. And so you sit there and you go, okay, it doesn't mean that through our conservation efforts we're not going to do great things for bull trout. It's just that the shared vision's more of a cutthroat angle. Same thing with wolves. I mean, you guys heard the wolf issues and that type of thing. Grizzly bears, from a fur aspect, are probably something that it's easier to sit down with conservation partners right now and talk about. Up in the Blackfoot, for example, they had lots of grizzly bear issues when that partnership started. Now they've been able to work with producers. A big issue was the dead carcasses that they put out behind the calving grounds for young stock that died during calving season. They had a great and innovative idea now where Fish and Wildlife Service sponsors a truck that goes around during the calving season, picks up those dead carcasses, and so we've taken care of a lot of those grizzly bear issues where we were pulling animals in, and all of a sudden, you know, we had issues with human protection and livestock kill, and so a lot of that's been fixed, and it's actually a success story now, and so that's a species that could work as a good focal. I think a really good thing that you keep in the back of your mind as a practitioner in conservation is something that David Mannix, an absolutely visionary rancher in the Blackfoot, came up with. And it's a rule that they use publicly at a lot of meetings. They call it their 80-20 rule. And so this shared vision idea, 80% of what people can come together on and do amazing things in conservation is what they spend their time talking about. But there's always issues that come up that are related to conservation, but that aren't central to what that group's trying to achieve. And anytime you start to talk about those, you go, 20% rule. And you go, yep, let's table that for right now and stay on topic. And that has, it's more of a human dimension aspect to conservation, but it means everything in terms of trying to get to your goals. Point number 3 for the day is this idea of building long-term trust and credibility. And so a lot of times you have to start small in conservation to build those personal relationships if you want to be able to do real lasting and large-scale landscape conservation. One way that they do that in the Blackfoot is community spray days. And so everybody gets together. You got to understand what your partner thinks about and what they do. And so like in that landscape course 560 I teach, we go up in the spring and we go to Jim Stone's ranch and I take students branding. And that's a community event. You can walk in their shoes for a day and you understand what's important to them so that you can envision where you can find common ground. A lot of that has to do with what we call proper pacing. And so you can't expect from a conservation perspective to identify a high priority resource, go into that community, and think that in a year you're going to show up and everybody's going to listen to you. You have to go into those communities, be slow and deliberate, find who the focal people and the champions are that other folks in that community listen to, and enjoy living there, be part of the community, get into social aspects, maybe join onto the fire department, that type of thing, whatever you find is real and natural. A foot in the door a lot of the time is weeds. Everybody hates weeds. But the point is to find that common ground, because landowners identify with an individual person, not with an agency or a badge. And so you go up into those landscapes, there's conservation people everywhere, but they're part of the community, and they don't always have their badges on and their guns. They're talking one-on-one, and that's where those long-term relationships and trust is built. Here's an example of Nidecker standing next to a wetland that he worked with this producer to put as a restoration project. That was 3 years of spraying weeds, understanding what that person's need was from a cattle ranching, how he wanted to use that water, but then how it could have joint benefit for wildlife. And so another great concept is that you got to make deposits before you make withdrawals. And it's just part of building trust and credibility with people. And so that on-the-ground coordination, and probably when you guys get jobs, more than half of you are going to be doing this stuff in real life. It's those social skill sets that I don't think we probably teach enough in universities, but that are just vital to you guys' success and to success in conservation as a whole. These things in terms of integrity, not showing frustration when you get resisted, dealing well with ambiguity. When you say you're going to do something, do it on time, follow up, provide tangible results, interpersonal savvy, and relating well to people. I mean, every single one of us got into this profession because we like to touch animals and trap animals and watch animals and that kind of thing. How many of you like to walk into a room like this and walk up, try and remember everybody's name and do that kind of thing, right? Maybe a few do. Most go, God, I think after the talk I'll just go home. It'd just be a lot easier because I'm not that social animal that some people are. If you got to work at that and get better at it, spend a lot of time doing that. And then learning on the fly and being solution oriented. This idea that as a professor doing research and stuff, when I look at students, yeah, it's GREs and GPA and all that kind of stuff. Here's what I look for. I look for a maze-bright student. In other words, you find a problem, am I the first person that you come to and you go, oh, I can't figure this out, what's the answer? No. You come in and you say, I have 5 plausible solutions. Here's what they are. Can you think of something I can't? And so that maze-bright person is the key to on-the-ground conservation and bringing all those partners together. Fixing what's wrong, right? 4 keys in conservation: protection, management, restoration, and education. I'll spend the most time on these 3. First one is protection. You guys have seen, you lived in Missoula long enough, the bumper sticker, cows not condos, right? That idea that you've got to be able to proactively identify where the best landscapes are and then be able to do that conservation that where you're not going to end up with death by 1,000 cuts, right? And so subdivision, energy development, roads, all of those things that a little bit of in and of themselves, no big deal. But once you reach that threshold of cumulative impacts, no matter what you do at local scales, you're not going to be able to implement enough conservation that you can hit a home run and keep those most imperiled and large-scale species that we're looking to conserve long-term. But then a lot of folks think about, oh, we'll just put it into public land and it'll be great. Not the case at all. Some of the most productive land is in private ranches in low elevations. Management then, you can't just walk away, right? And so protection is one aspect, but then management is another one. Things like fish entrainments, passages, upland enhancement, grazing management. Even if this was always going to be in grassland, right? You could go out and that's overgrazed. We could get into working with producers and providing incentive-based programs to do rest and rotational and deferred grazing programs that would probably get him more beef on the hoof and better productivity and sustainability of his ranch, and that would also turn around and provide more residual and hiding cover for the types of animals that would do better under those circumstances. And so you can't just walk away. And then restoration. Even if you work in the very best of the best places on earth, you can go into those landscapes and find places where we've probably made poor decisions in the past that could use improvement. And so you see some before-after pictures. And I'll talk more about stream restoration in a minute. So then, using science to assess biological outcomes, which is probably what we think about the most in our jobs, and from a research aspect, and if you're grad students, that's where you spend a lot of your time in terms of the science and research. But if I was out in California, a room full of 30 producers that we were trying to get signed up with Sage Grouse Initiative, and there were about 20 federal employees there. And so I asked the federal employees, I said, how many times in your job do you get to the end of the year and your metric of success is how many acres you treated, like burned, grazed, hayed, thinned, that type of thing? And they go, well, yeah, that's sort of what we do. And you go, so just the numbers of acres that we did something to is our metric of success in conservation. And you go, gosh, I'm not sure that that actually assesses whether or not we reached our biological outcomes. And so I think we've got a new day, so to speak, with SHC, Strategic Habitat Conservation. And so I kind of put up what I think is our old business model on the left and our new business model on the right, where we used to be very agency specific, right? Forest Service, we do this on Forest Service land. Well, okay, what's BLM doing? We have no idea. We don't mess with those guys. Well, now all of a sudden, we're much more collaborative, because just like a grizzly bear doesn't recognize where that fence is, I don't think the agency should recognize where those fences are. We used to be opportunity driven, right? It was like going out and shooting trap and you fire off a load of 7.5 shot and it goes everywhere. So in other words, first person in that wanted to do conservation with an agency, you say, sure, we'll do something with you. And what you end up with is a big splattering of things that you hope afterwards all roll up into something good for wildlife. And you go, gosh, does it or not? We used to be planning averse. Now all of a sudden we need to be science driven and planning intense. And so we need to know biologically where are those best resources so that we can plan. Because if we only have $1 every time we spend it, we want to make sure that we're getting our biggest benefit for that, for our return on investment. And so management actions used to be treated as they were objectives. Oh yeah, we burned 1,000 acres last year, restored 10 miles of stream. Really, what did you get for that? Well, we don't know what the population benefits were. And so I think we are now trying to bridge those gaps. Monitoring and research, kind of stuff a lot of us like to do, we're sort of, we ran out of money, sorry. All of a sudden those become indispensable in terms of providing accountability. And so maybe this was an old traditional activity-based management objective. And people that really good at this early on were from the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. And so like if you go to the mid-continent of North America where 75% of all the ducks are produced, probably the best of the best is the Missouri-Coteau in central North Dakota. And so if you were a district wetland manager out there, you might say, well, what am I going to do this year? And you may have come up with a planning objective that says, well, I'm going to increase wetland and grassland management for waterfowl in the Missouri-Coteau. Seems like a reasonable objective, but really, if you dissect it, that attainment of that objective doesn't require that you consider factors that limit populations. It doesn't matter where or how much habitat actually gets conserved. So there's no benchmark for success. There's little accountability, right? We're out there doing good stuff. Provides little justification for increased conservation resources, right? So if you can't show your success, it's going to be tough to go back and go, oh, we're halfway to our biological target. If we had $10 million more, we'd get there. And so you could actually achieve this objective without having any positive effect on breeding mallard populations. Here's where I think we're headed now in the future. More of an outcome-based management objective, where you say, I'm going to provide wetland, first of all, I'm in the best of the best. I'm going to provide wetland habitat sufficient to attract 15,000 breeding pairs, maintain enough grassland nesting habitat in a spatial arrangement that yields a nest success that's 15% over a 10-year period. So now all of a sudden you go out, if you know anything about ducks, you sit there and you go, okay, breeding pairs, right? Ducks are attracted during migration in the spring to water. And so then they set up their little pair isolation and fill each seasonal wetland. How many ducks are we talking about? So now we've got a biological goal, enough grassland nesting habitat. Ooh, okay, so that's the other half of the recipe for recruiting ducks into a population. They're attracted to water, but then they nest in the uplands, and you've got to have big enough blocks of hiding cover that you don't make life so easy for a predator that depredation of nests decreases your population. All of the population viability analyses that have been done say on average you need a nest success, which is the vital rate that drives population growth, of about 15% to maintain stable populations. And we've given that a time period for success. We're going to look at 10 years. And so all of a sudden now, your biological or management objective recognizes the current capacity of the system, what the major limiting factors are, what from a management perspective you could actually remediate, and it gives you a nice foundation for estimating resources that will be required for that success. Yeah, maybe it takes $20 million. And you say, well, we can't ever say $20 million. They tell them what it's going to cost. Tell them what's realistic. And it's explicit and measurable, and so you get accountability out of the deal. And so, especially with federal government funds, right? Office of Management and Budget's getting stingy now. And so they're going to give it to you once, but then you need to be able to go back and tell them what you achieved. And if you can tell them what you achieved and how far you got, the chance that you can continue that, regardless of administrations and all the other political garbage that happens, you can stay under the radar and get to those long-term biological goals. So let me show you one example. 4 C's in native trout biology, right? Clean, cold, complex, and connected. Here's one of our favorite focal species. Kleinschmidt Creek, back to the Blackfoot Valley. They went out physically, narrowed and deepened the stream channel, inserted coarse woody debris, got cattle out of the stream, not by fencing it off and telling the producer you can't be there, but instead by thinking of what was important to that conservation partner and coming up into the upland and providing offsite water to the producer to get rid of that cattle issue down in the stream. Narrowed it, deepened it, and here's what it looks like today. All along, they had some good science going on. The mechanistic link to more fish as a result of those management actions is lower water temperatures. And so through time, here's pre-restoration and post-restoration water temperatures, and they got those streams below the threshold that was necessary to keep fingerlings alive. That's the type of thing then, for west slope cuts, you can go back to your conservation partners and say, yeah, then we went out and we did the fish shocking, and 10 years ago we had about 3 fish greater than 6 inches in size. We've got a 7-fold increase. We've taken every stream in the Blackfoot, we've classified it as to what its restoration needs are. We're 70% of the way home. Here's what it costs. And if we can get the last 30%, here's what it's going to cost. Will you stay with us long enough to actually get the job done? So, closing sort of second half of the talk then. Got a chance, Chief White in USDA that runs Natural Resource Conservation Service, used to be our state conservationist in Bozeman. He was excited about sage grouse and the potential link between sustainability of rural ways of life and ranching in the West and the compatibility of that with sagebrush-dominated grasslands for sage grouse. Did that while he was here, then he got tapped by the current administration to lead NRCS nationwide. If you know anything about the Food Security Act, right, the conservation title of the Farm Bill, huge money. I pulled the budget for the Fish and Wildlife Service for fiscal year 2011. If you add up every conservation program, every dollar that they could throw at doing the good things for wildlife, it's about $594 million. And you go, boy, that's a lot. Not when you compare it to the Farm Bill. About a $5 billion Farm Bill program. And so you go, who could really do something for wildlife in the West if they wanted to? And so in March 2010, Secretary Vilsack announced a new sage grouse initiative check out this. NRCS will take bold steps to ensure conservation of sage grouse and sustainability of working ranches in the West. Our targeted approach will seek out projects that offer the highest potential for boosting bird populations. Oh, relevancy, right? Nobody has a better open door to private ranchers than NRCS. They've done that stuff forever. They have range conservationists in every district of every county of every state in the West. They all know their producers. They're range conservationists, so they can talk about cattle and sheep production 100 times better than any wildlife professor wonk like I can. And so you say, geez, can I play a role at all in advising from a science capacity so that the way that we deliver the Farm Bill has both conservation benefits and benefits to those producers? Most of those producers, they don't care about sage grouse. But if those conservation dollars increase the sustainability of their ranch and improve the ecological site conditions, that's good for sage grouse and it's good for ranching. And so there's the relevancy and the natural tie. And holy cow, targeting programs from NRCS used to be first one in the door, first come, first serve. It's a whole new way of doing business for them. And so the first thing we did, just so that they could prioritize, was to produce what we call sage grouse core areas. And so we worked with WAFA, right, Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, who go out every spring and they count leks. It's where the males fly in, they do their fancy dance. We go out, count males, and it's a good index to population size. And so we took all of that lek data from 11 states, did some fancy GIS stuff, and developed a core area concept. Cool part of this is that those birds on 186 million acres of occupied distribution in the West aren't randomly distributed. It's clumped. And so all of a sudden you go, ooh, that's prioritization, that's conservation triage, we can do that. And so a quarter of all of the breeding males are the red areas. That's 4% of the range distribution. It's additive, so if you go red plus orange, that's 50% of the population on about a quarter of the range. Add in yellow and add in blue, and that's 100% of all the breeding areas. So a 30,000-foot proactive look across 11 states to go, where would you go spend your first dollar if you wanted to do something good? Been working on energy development for almost 10 years. Turns out that Wyoming, from a core area perspective, has more birds than any other of the 11 states. 37% of all the greater sage grouse in the world sit right in that one state. And so here's what the core areas look like in terms of Wyoming. And so then got a chance to work for 2 years with the BLM. In black is where oil and gas wells, and obviously the scale's not right, but you get the idea. In the ground, operational oil and gas wells are the black dots. All of the gray areas is where the Bureau of Land Management, which manages our federal mineral resource, had already authorized exploration and potential development of oil and gas. And so they said, we don't know what the impacts of this stuff are. And so you guys, if you've stuck around for a while, you remember Brett Walker, Kevin Doherty, that group of PhD students did a bunch of work that showed, yeah, inside of energy fields, populations plummet. The threshold of human disturbance that results from energy development is way above that which sage grouse tolerate. So the adult birds stay but die at high rates. The young birds look at the human impact. They have an imprint on the landscape. They leave and recruit to other landscapes. Outside of gas fields, populations were going up and down just like you'd think. And so you go, God, this is a big impact. And so we had done some of the applied science to look at what those impacts are, but then turned around too and said, okay, I wonder what the thresholds are in terms of what birds can tolerate. And so we've done that work, published it quickly in PLOS, that Public Library of Science, and lo and behold, Governor Freudenthal embraced that core area concept. Wyoming Game and Fish Department is a leader in core area concept for sage grouse conservation triage. So they turned around and have now put together sage grouse core areas. And so all these green areas encompass about a quarter of the state, but they also encompass about 83% of all the birds. And so they're trying to find ways where we can have energy security and do some drilling, but at the same time not decimate sage grouse populations and rangelands. And so Wyoming Game and Fish has this biological game plan based on conservation triage for sage grouse. Then Governor just came out about a month ago with a new executive order that said in those sage grouse core areas, we'll only have one oil or gas well and its associated infrastructure per square mile. And then they set up a GIS shop that said, and once we get a cumulative 5% disturbance on the landscape, no more development. And so all of a sudden you go, geez, we kind of have found a solution between the need for energy independence and for landscape conservation. Now we went back with USDA and tried to figure out what can we do to solve residual impacts in those landscapes that would otherwise decimate sage grouse. The big residual impact is, perfect, thanks. The big residual impact then is subdivision. And so we said, okay, let's make a quick planning tool. And so there's the sage grouse core areas, right? And you can see the darker colored ones have more males on leks in those cores. And so there's a real northeast to southwest gradient. And you see this red polygon. That's probably the highest risk of subdivision because everybody wants to look at the beautiful Wind River Range, right, and have their own 40-acre ranchette. Nothing wrong with that, but it's death by 1,000 cuts. And so we turned around and we said, okay, let's put in a proposal to do easements that would maintain rural ways of life and cattle ranching in these best of the best areas, but that wouldn't allow subdivision in those areas. And so that's what we're hoping and waiting for the phone call from NRCS that would give us those blessings. And then we sat down with the land trusts, right, that close the deals on conservation easements and have those ties to those local producers, and looked at how much private funding they would have, because that's going to be the match requirement to get the public money for conservation easements. When we work with producers, shared vision, climate change, big deal, but we don't sit at the coffee table and talk about climate change with cattle producers. Some of them believe it, some of them don't believe it. That's the 20%. There's no reason to talk about it. But in doing conservation planning, you should think about it. So Ann Schrag has new work out on climate change impacts and sagebrush habitat and West Nile virus transmission risk. And so in all of her model runs, so the black is where sagebrush dominated grasslands would remain under these different scenarios. And then she worked with Scott Miller out of University of Wyoming, who had a transmission risk growing degree day model looking at West Nile virus risk, laid that over the top and said, where's disease risk going to be the lowest in the future, and where would we have a high likelihood of maintaining sagebrush dominated landscapes? No matter which model run you look at, the places we're picking to spend big easement dollars seem to be compatible. And so we think we've got a win-win situation in terms of climate, rural ways of life, and the types of things that we're interested in for conservation. So real quick, let me show you, what do we have? We okay on time? Okay, let me show you then in terms of integrating science into spending USDA Farm Bill dollars for conservation. And so this year we were able to put $21 million on the ground for conservation. Sign-ups from state conservationists in those 11 states have requested another $25 million this year. We need to close that adaptive management feedback loop to make sure that what we're doing on the ground is actually benefiting birds in the way that we've anticipated. And so we've got one core area, back to the planning map. We took a big core area in Montana. Range conservationists for NRCS went out, walked each one of those ranches, sat down independently with each producer, talked about challenges and opportunities on their ranch where they could increase sustainability of it for cattle ranching and also do good things for sage grouse. Had a public meeting then, sat down. All of these ranches in pink signed up full Monty, so to speak, for sage grouse conservation. Rotational grazing systems, marking and removing hazardous fences near leks, all of this type of stuff we were trying to achieve. The two ranches in blue said, thanks, but no thanks. And you go, that's okay. Sat down, some time went by, they talked to their other ranchers that they already trust, and they said, yeah, we did it. They came back and they enrolled. There's one ranch in the green that has it. But all of those acres add up to about 90,000 acres contracted, 70,000 acres that have enrolled for all of the potential benefits that the NRCS program could offer. So then we went back and said, oh, tremendous. We're marking birds inside of this treatment area, and then in an area juxtaposed to it with similar landscape conditions where we're not doing anything from a sage grouse perspective. And so we'll have control and impact areas. We'll look at vegetative response in year 1 and 2, radio mark sage grouse. We'll look at vital rate response in terms of chick survival, nest success, and adult survival, which we know are the vital rates that drive population growth. And then eventually in years 4, 5, and 6, the proof should be in the pudding, where we should be seeing more males on Lex, which is our index to population size. And so from a pure wonky science perspective, like a professor at a university, how often do you get to work in a landscape where you can actually impact enough acres so that you could expect that biological benefit? And so we'll see if it works. If it does, we got a home run, and we're going to replicate that success. If not, we're going to have to go back adaptively, tweak what we're doing, and make it better. All of the stressors across the range differ, so you got to line up population benefits with threats so that you're doing the right things in the right places. So that was Montana. I'll take you out to Oregon now. The biggest, so here's a blow up of Oregon. This was an independent study done by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. We identified the same spot that we wanted to work, which is the biggest core area, contains the most birds anywhere in Oregon. The issue out there is more encroached conifer. And so otherwise tremendous habitat, the shrub, forb community, grass, everything's there, but you've got encroached trees. Sage grouse hate tall structures. I don't know if they're hardwired to hate them or if there's actually a predator avoidance response built in. Whatever it is, otherwise suitable habitat, they don't go there. And so we've turned around then to evaluate the benefits of removing encroached conifer. And so, I gotta remember the slide I put in there. No, not yet. And so we have a study area there where BLM had radio marked birds where they were concerned about potential wind development. By marking those birds, the wind energy concerns went away, opened up the door to a beautiful before-after control impact design for us. And so now NRCS is paying to have radio marked birds in that area. Before and after, we remove 40,000 acres of encroached conifer over a 138,000 acre area. And then the gravelies are right next to it. We'll mark birds there. There were 7 leks. There's only 3 that are still active with males in the spring, and encroached conifer's choking that thing to death. We're just going to watch what those birds do. We'll have a before-after control impact design. And if that actually works the way that we think it's going to, we'll have opened up 130,000 acres. But more importantly, we'll be able to replicate that success in California, Nevada, and Oregon that are all suffering from that impact. But from a triage perspective, you're not going to cut all of those trees down. And so what we've done is we've taken core areas, overlaid them. There's about 6 million acres where we could do the very best biological job of benefiting sage grouse. 6 million acres is still way too much. And so you can see the impacts of conifer encroachment from 1939, same area. All of this black stuff is trees. And so there's some what they call legacy trees that should be there, but then all of that encroached conifer is just absolutely choking wildlife populations, mule deer, you name it. So our focal species of sage grouse is doing a good job in terms of pointing us in the right direction. Work with Nature Conservancy, Jeff Evans, guys at GIS Wiz. We're going to build them a 6 million acre planning tool using the new wavelet analyses. So you know in GIS how you overlay a grid and each little pixel gets a gray shade from 0 to 256, and you go, yeah, 0 to 100's water, 101 to 140's trees, this is grass. But we're not very good at mapping objects. And so with these new Gaussian techniques, you can turn around and you can map objects, trees, because these trees are just little inclusions in an otherwise grassland area. And so this is what some of the initial output looks like. And so what we can do then, 6 million acres, we can look at where are birds, where's the least encroachment, so that we can spend the least per acre opening those areas back up, and we'll get an economic approach to doing the very best we can, the very quickest we can. But then you think shared vision, and you go, what's the next step? This is good for birds, but you can get a basal area of those trees. And so we've got guys out clipping plots under trees and outside of treed areas. And sure, there's more grass. Basically, those trees shaded out. And then we'll bring in an economist from Oregon State. He'll tell us how much basically more grass we can grow with conifer removal. And that's your shared vision linked back to producers where they go, wow, more grass, better cattle production, I'll manage it the right way, trees are gone, you get birds, I get my rural way of life. And I think that's the shared vision, and that's the talk I want to give, to go back to office and management and budget and say, give us money for a long enough time, don't make this a 1 or 2 year deal. Intangible lessons to wrap up then. Back to triage versus opportunistic conservation. Have the courage to say no. There are just some places, this happens to be southwest Wyoming in the Jonah Anticline, one of the most productive, deep, conventional gas fields in the world. I don't care what you do locally by going in and trying to enhance this vegetation, that cumulative footprint, you can never get around. Give it up. Go away. Just walk away. Find the next and the very best place and invest there for the next 50 and 100 years. Sounds easy, people giggle. It's the toughest thing in the world for some folks to do in conservation. Patience. This stuff doesn't happen overnight. We waited almost 10 years to figure out from an energy aspect, how do sage grouse react, what's that mean, and then get that in the policy. 10 years. And just now, we'll probably wait another 5 or 10 for all of those easements and subdivision risk to be alleviated if we can figure that out. So conservation, it's a marriage, not a date. You got to be patient. You got to be in it for the long haul. You got to pick your battles and fight the right ones. Here's my closing one. Maybe it's academics, maybe it's just me. The coolest thing in life, don't hang out with people that know what you know. Hang out with people that know what you don't know, and that's how you find shared vision. It's how you unlock the key to things that you never thought you could figure out by yourself. And when you're doing it in those landscapes that we care most about, most of the time it's not going to be someone else at a university. It's not going to be another conservation kind of person. It's probably going to be the people that live there, understand the land, understand what they need economically to make a living there. And we call those the focal people, council of elders, whatever you say there. Hook up with those people, understand what they need, line that up with what you need, and I think you find success in where you're going. And ultimately, it's for these guys right here, that next generation. If it stops with me, if it stops with you guys, and if we don't get there, everything that we've done in our careers gets canceled out. How'd I do for time? All right, thanks. I'll let you run it. Great. How's it going?
So is anyone besides Gail Patricelli looking at stress physiology or immune function in these guys? Is that kind of thing, would that be useful all in the system, or is that too way sciencey?
Yeah, potentially useful. And Gail, yeah, I don't know if you guys went to Gail's talk. She was one of our ecology seminar speakers a couple of months back. Yeah, just a little bit, yep. So this woman out of UC Davis actually took a stuffed sage grouse, fitted the electronics. She can take it out on a little rail system out in the middle of the lek, and the males see what male response. It's crazy what she figured out. And she's a behavioralist by trade, more so than a physiologist. And she's looking at what happens when you get a big enough, heavy enough human footprint on the landscape. And she's sort of finding out that males, when they puff up their air sacs and do their dance and scrape their wings and do all that, that females and males can't communicate as well because we're above some decibel threshold that allows that breeding behavior to take place. And so yeah, that's cool stuff that's going on. Question becomes this is world according to Dave, and it's probably wrong. If we knew that, what would we do about it?
Well, so my question actually isn't quite as much that, but is there any way to incorporate that sort of investigation into the populations you're looking at that would help the conservation work you're going forward? And I don't know.
Yeah, and Brett Walker, love that concept. He's got poop off of Lex from birds inside and outside energy development that we've never done anything with. That could be a potential link if you wanted to do some glucocorticoid kind of stuff. I'm no pro on that. That's the biggest word I know in the stuff you work on. But yeah, that could be a potential link there.
You talk a lot about the importance of, working with the local folks and getting integrated in the community, really getting to know the area. And that totally makes sense to me. I understand how you do that if you actually live where your study area. Because a lot of times we have these huge study areas, like, it looks like you're working in 11 states. So how do you give me advice for how you, like, I don't want to use the phrase get your foot in the door because you use that phrase in terms of weeds, but, like with areas that, you're not going to be able to live there and not going to be able to spend a ton of your time there, but you still want to meet those people.
Yep. I'll be dead honest with you, and then somebody else chime in. This isn't just I feel like I'm in my PhD orals. My answer to, I don't know. From the folks that live, I don't live this stuff either. I learn it from folks that live it. Greg Nidecker, I think, would tell you from his Blackfoot experience. A couple other folks that are doing really cool stuff in the field would probably agree that it's going to take 2 to 5 years of a person embedded within a community and living there every day to build that level of trust and credibility, understand what the social issues are, and become part of the community to really be effective. And I know you're going, well, that stinks. You're doing international work. And I don't know how you do that stuff without living it. So I think you had told me you were thinking Fulbright and try to get down there.
Yeah, I just say large study areas where you even might even live in the north end of it, but it's 500 miles long, and there's nothing in the north has nothing to do with the southern part of your area.
Yeah.
Multiple states, like you're talking about with the stage grouse.
If that's really the important place where we should be investing for 100 years or more, there probably needs to be a coordinator, but then you may have to take additional people, and maybe the ultimate answer isn't one person. It's 5 or 6 people put in the right areas to be able to deliver that level of conservation. Yeah.
Have they started doing this with any other species, kind of strategic conservation planning with like a lot of different agencies? Like, is that going beyond like sage grouse and sage grouse habitat? Have they started with any other species?
Malpite borderlands. I mean, you could lift. I actually had that in the talk, and I thought I was going to. The question that these successful groups, because it's just getting going, what's portability, right? Is there something so different about the Blackfoot? Your landowners are different. No. It's the people that we put there that if there's any social conflict or lack of skill sets, every time you point at somebody, there's 4 fingers pointing back at you. We're doing something wrong there because there is a social connection in every one of these places. It may take a while to develop, but yeah, so it is happening other places. This isn't something I thought of. I'm just trying to take lessons learned and apply them to the stuff I work on. And so, yeah, it is happening other places. Anybody in the audience with sage grouse can accuse me of single species management. I mean, we ought to be looking at mule deer, critical winter range. We ought to have, a brewer sparrow or something like that going, yep, fur, fin, and feather. Here's focal species. We got enough data. We know enough about them. They got big ranges, complex seasonal habitats. If we do good things for these, we think everything will come along. That's ultimately where we need to get going. And it's cool because, you go, oh my God, USDA has all this. They have lots of financial assistance. They have very little technical assistance. And so they always need more range conservationists on the ground making these connections, doing the inventories to be able to do the conservation practices. And so we need to get better at how we view putting people on the landscape to find that common vision. Just with sage grouse, one of the ways we've been trying to solve that is Mule Deer Foundation called up and said, you know what? Go ahead, grab the tail feathers of a sage grouse and ride it as far as you can in terms of conservation. What you guys are doing is really similar to what we want done. If you're short on TA, let's you throw in 50% of a position on the ground and let the sage grouse money throw in 50% of a position, and all of a sudden we've got 20 in an area instead of 10. So I think it's those innovative things that you think about as you're moving along. Christy?
So with regards to the work that you guys did with impacting oil and gas decisions in Wyoming, with Governor Katie Hobbs embracing the core areas, was that only regarding the state land? So because a lot of the leases in Wyoming are federal, right? So were you guys able to also impact the leases on the BLM land as well in that? Or was that more towards the state land?
That was more towards the state lands, but now BLM is following suit, and there's been some good stories in the newspaper now where they're stopping sales of some leases and getting on board with these thresholds in energy development. And you know that country well. It's way more federal than it is state or private. And in fact, those easements, we'd be looking at the interstitial maybe 30% on private lands, and we got to get across those different ownerships to be able to impact public as well if you want to get at the scales at which these critters are perceiving their habitats. Dr. Berger.
How do you build a plan in that's independent of political appointees, meaning Salazar now, somebody former, somebody later, when you're talking about BLM lands and parcels and amount of surface disturbance?
Yep. Two responses. One, that's why I love NRCS and working with USDA right now, and I'm not saying that just because I'm doing it with them. We have as much success going to the Senate office and briefing the staffers of the Republican senators, because what they see is, ranching, that's who's voting for us in our western districts right now. And so when we think shared vision, we're thinking both place-based shared vision as well as DC shared vision. And so that's why I think we do have a fighting chance, even after November 10th or 3rd or whenever, that this could continue on and maybe even past, a current administration. And I think that's bipartisan right now. People go, you know what? This feels good. It feels good on this side and it feels good on this side. That's a huge deal. Mm-hmm.
You kind of talked about picking your battles within the conservation world, about which species you want to, put money and time into, and we have these limited amount of resources. To personal opinion on those species that are super charismatic, they have a lot of public, support, but in the long run, you as a scientist just don't see these species becoming viable again and recovering, unless, because their habitat is so degraded and they just they don't have a place in the modern world.
Mm-hmm. Tell me more. Say, give me something else, because I'm not totally clicking on your question yet.
Sorry,
Give me an example. What's an example?
I guess tigers over in Asia, or polar bears whose habitat is totally disappearing right now, or tigers, how they aren't going to. They've just lost so much habitat that without conservation efforts for prolonged periods of time, and maybe never, they won't recover again because they've just lost so much habitat.
Sure. Okay. One of our biggest issues internationally, and I'm going way out on a limb now, is that we don't have the quality of spatial imagery, planning tools, inventory information, and that kind of thing. And so lots of times we don't have that 30,000-foot vision from sage grouse core areas and that kind of thing to totally understand where the biological resources are let alone the social resources where we could overlay the Venn diagram for success. And so I think that's the huge challenge internationally. And yeah, if you don't have some of those products, it can be really tough to put together a comprehensive plan that you feel like could work. And so that massive challenge. You got anything else on that, Joel, internationally? I mean, you live that stuff compared to...
Not a pithy answer.
Yeah, all right. So yeah, it's tough. If you don't know where your resources are to be able to make a game plan, to know where to invest, I agree. That's a tough place to start. Mm-hmm.
I guess I was going to follow up on that and say, you take the domestic species like caribou and Idaho Panhandle, and you do have the tools and resources. And, you know, I guess it's a hard question. When do you pull the plug if the species is on life support?
If you only looked at it from a U.S. perspective, you'd be there till the last caribou's gone. And then you look north and you go, God, they've got them everywhere. From a state perspective, that may be goal number one. From a landscape perspective, it may not be. And so, yeah, I think I got a great example for you. With NRCS, we're targeting those resources, but at the same time, that targeting still includes funds that are going to go to each of 11 states. And so all of a sudden you look at the map and you go, well, so we're not just spending every dollar in Wyoming? Nope, we're spending it across 11 states. So we have distributional goals as well as abundance goals. And part of that is maybe what Joel spoke to in terms of how you put a political strategy together that can give you life for a long amount of time. We're going to spend money in every state, and so we have to triage in every state. Doesn't mean that we're going to do it willy-nilly, but there's going to have to be goals within each state so we're in the best of the best so that they contribute overall to the best. If one of those political borders for caribou is Canada and the US, you probably mark the place we're going to go. Canada's probably not going to come necessarily work here. We may not work that much up there just because politically those dollars can't always cross the fence. So yeah, that's where the whole focal species idea and the social has to balance the biological. And I know so little about caribou, I'm going to shut up now. Got one more, Robin? Or we go? Okay, fire away.
So it's super important to relate to the ranchers and stuff. How do you personally, when you're approaching them with a conservation idea, build rapport with them initially? Because that first impression is super, super important.
Sure. Yep. Well, like in two answers. First one, like in this 560 class, and people always laugh and stuff, we spend a lot of time doing this. Hi, my name's Dave Noggle.
Nice to meet you.
Pleasure. Looks me right in the eye, gives me a firm handshake, fine, you know, just those very simple kind. You take your sunglasses off when you meet somebody. So I mean, those personal skill sets, but then you say, well, how do you do it when you meet a ranch? When I go to Roundup doing that grazing study, I don't go knock on the rancher's door. I bring the NRCS person that inventoried their ranch, set up that grazing system, and probably hand-delivered that USDA check. And they say, this is Dave Noggle. Here's the kinds of things we wanted to do to follow up in monitoring and inventory and try and strike that deal. So it's not me walking in cold because they go, you know what, who are you? You're nobody. Oh, God, University of Montana, oh, you're kidding me. I hate the Grizzlies. You know, maybe they're cats. You're dead. So you go with the people that have built that trust and credibility, and then hopefully you're smart enough that you don't screw it up once you do when I do open my big fat mouth. That kind of thing. Yep. That's great. Okay, thanks.